He arrived in America with 2 suitcases, one filled with clothes, the other with fear. The year was 1919, and the war had just ended. The world was rebuilding. Paper money was everywhere, and optimism was for sale. But to Anton Weiss, a baker's son from Eastern Europe, optimism printed on paper didn't smell like trust. It smelled like ink. He had seen money die once. Back home, after the Great War, his father had sold bread for wheelbarrows of marks that were worthless by nightfall. He remembered the neighbors who had trusted the government's promises, people who went to sleep with savings and woke up with paper that couldn't buy a candle. When Anton boarded the ship to New York, he swore one thing: he would never trust paper again. The America he stepped into was nothing like the place he had imagined. The air smelled of coal and iron, and every city street hummed with a new kind of faith, a belief in modern money. The dollar was strong, the banks were booming, and the newspapers called it the century of prosperity. Everyone believed that paper was progress. Anton didn't argue. He just nodded, worked, and saved, not in notes, but in gold coins. He found work at a small foundry in a Pennsylvania town named Millhaven. It was the kind of town that existed because someone had decided to build a factory there, and everyone else had followed. The local bank was the proudest building in town, marble steps, brass doors, and a manager who wore white gloves on Sundays. Every Friday, Anton received his pay in crisp bills. Every Saturday, he went to the jeweler's shop at the corner of Main and 4th, where an old safe sat behind the counter. There, quietly, he exchanged his wages for gold coins, $20 at a time, no questions asked. The shopkeeper, Mr. Callahan, thought odd but didn't care. Gold doesn't argue, he liked to say. Years passed. The town grew. A new school was built. The bank expanded. People took loans to buy cars, radios, and houses. The more they borrowed, the richer they felt. Debt, the mayor said, is the engine of the new America. Anton kept working, kept saving, and kept doubting to his co-workers. He was polite but distant, the quiet man who never joined card games or union meetings. When asked about his savings, he simply smiled and said, "I trust what doesn't burn." In 1925, the bank hosted a ceremony for its new wing. The president, standing on the marble steps, announced that the town had entered a golden age of prosperity. Anton happened to be walking by. He stopped listening. The man's words echoed through the street, bouncing off brick walls. "Our paper," the banker said, "is as good as gold." Anton smiled. He had heard that before. By 1928, he had enough gold to fill a small chest. He buried it under floorboards of his rented house, marking the spot with a single loose nail. Every coin felt heavy with memory, of bread that cost billions, of promises that turned to dust. He didn't call it wealth. He called it insurance against madness. Then came 1929. At first, it was whispers, a few headlines about Wall Street panic. Stocks fell, then fell again. The factory cut hours. The bank stopped lending. One morning, a line of men stood outside its brass doors, waiting to withdraw their savings. By noon, the doors were locked. By nightfall, rumors spread. The bank was out of cash. Millhaven, like thousands of towns across America, had been built on credit. When credit vanished, so did everything else. Anton watched quietly as panic swept through the streets. Shops closed. Families packed wagons and left. Neighbors who once mocked a stubborn thrift came to him, asking for loans. He didn't gloat. He helped, but not with money. He paid grocery bills in gold, helped his landlord fix roofs in exchange for grain, and kept his furnace running when others froze. Gold, in those years, was more than metal. It was time. It was dignity. The Depression deepened. By 1932, the factory where Anton worked was shut. The streets of Millhaven filled with men selling tools, watches, even wedding rings. The bank building stood empty, its marble steps cracked, the words "in God we trust" barely visible through the grime. Then came 1933. The new president, Franklin Roosevelt, announced what he called a necessary national measure. Citizens were ordered to surrender their gold to the government in exchange for paper. It was illegal to hoard gold. They said, "Your country needs it more than you do." Anton sat by the window that night, staring at the chest under his floor. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't in years: fear. The same kind of fear his father had felt when soldiers came for the family's grain decades earlier. The uniform had changed, but the logic hadn't. The next morning, neighbors lined up at the post office, handing over their coins, some weeping, others laughing nervously. Anton stayed home. For days, he didn't move the chest. He listened to the radio speeches, the promises, the calls for unity. He heard the same melody that had played before every collapse. He knew what came next. At night, he dug up the chest. The soil was cold, the coins colder. He packed them carefully into a small sack, wrapped in cloth, and carried it to Mr. Callahan's old shop. The jeweler had closed years earlier, but the safe was still there, rusted but intact. Anton broke the lock, left the gold inside, and sealed it shut with nails. On the door, he carved a single word: trust. Then he left town. Anton disappeared the same way he had lived. Quietly, no one saw him leave. No one asked where he went. The depression dragged on, and Millhaven forgot its silent immigrant. Years passed. The factory rusted. The streets emptied. The Grand Marble Bank was converted into a storage hall, its vaults filled not with cash, but with dust. When the war came, the town came alive again. Men enlisted, factories reopened, and new families arrived. After 1945, the United States entered another golden age, a different kind this time, backed by confidence, credit, and the illusion of endless growth. The war had proven that money, once again, could be created out of promise. Millhaven began to prosper. But Anton Weiss did not return. Not yet. He spent years moving from place to place. First to Chicago, then to California, always working quietly, always saving. He never trusted the stock market, never bought bonds, never held a checking account. He carried his wages in envelopes and sometimes paid for a room with coins, earning strange looks but no questions. When the war ended and prices stabilized, he began to think of Millhaven again. He was old now, gray-haired, slower, but unbroken. One autumn morning in 1951, he returned. The town looked smaller than he remembered. The bank's brass doors were gone, the jeweler's shop boarded up, and the air smelled of gasoline instead of coal. He went to the corner of Main and 4th, the place where Mr. Callahan's safe still sat behind a rotting wall. It took him a day to pry it open. Inside, wrapped in cloth and dust, the gold gleamed, untarnished, eternal, heavier than memory. Word spread fast. People whispered about the old man who had left with nothing and returned with treasure. Some said he'd robbed a train. Others said he'd worked for the government. Anton said nothing. He simply began buying. First, the abandoned foundry where he once worked. Then, the neighboring lots. Then, the old bakery, the hardware store, the gas station. Most owners were eager to sell. They had debts or were leaving town. He paid in cash backed by gold certificates. Legal again now, though rare. Within 2 years, Anton Weiss owned nearly half of Millhaven. But he didn't build mansions or banks. He rebuilt the town itself. He reopened the factory, hired workers at fair wages, and restored the small school that had closed during the war. He opened a bakery, the same trade his father had known, where the smell of bread once again filled the air. When asked about his wealth, he always gave the same answer: paper burns, gold endures. But people are worth more. To the locals, he became a mystery wrapped in kindness. To the bankers who came offering loans, he was polite but amused. "You want me to borrow my own money?" he would say. By the mid-1950s, Millhaven was thriving again. The town newspaper published a story about the immigrant who rebuilt prosperity. Reporters came, eager to know his secret. He gave them none. All he said in one brief interview was, "I learned that money only lives as long as people believe in it, and belief dies faster than paper." But history, as it often does, began to repeat itself. In the 1970s, inflation crept back into the American vocabulary. The dollar, once tied to gold, was cut loose. Nixon's voice echoed through televisions. "We must suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold." The words were bureaucratic, but the meaning was familiar to Anton. Money had been untethered from reality once again. He watched quietly as prices rose, as markets soared, as everyone around him celebrated the age of easy credit. He was older now, his hands frail, but his eyes still sharp. "It begins again," he whispered. One night, he invited his workers to dinner at his bakery. The ovens glowed, the tables were filled with bread, and laughter filled the air. In the middle of the meal, he held up a small gold coin, one of his last from the chest. "This," he said softly, "is not just metal, it's memory. It reminds you that value doesn't live in paper or numbers. It lives in the things that can't be printed: work, trust, time." The room fell silent. Most didn't fully understand, but they never forgot his words. Anton Weiss died a few years later, in 1978, in the same small house he had once rented as a young worker. There was no grand funeral, no headlines, but when his will was read, it shocked the town. He had left everything: the land, the factories, the bakery, to the people of Millhaven. The legal document was simple: to those who build, not those who print. The town council didn't know what to do. Lawyers debated, but the meaning was clear. Anton's wealth, born from distrust, would now serve as trust itself. The factory became a cooperative. The bakery was kept running by the workers. The gold, which had slept through wars, crashes, and confiscations, was sold slowly to fund scholarships and rebuild public spaces. For decades after, people spoke of him in quiet awe, not as a miser or a prophet, but as someone who remembered what others forgot. The immigrants who came later heard his story like a fable. The man who refused paper, they said, the one who bought half a town in gold. But Anton's real legacy wasn't his fortune. It was his discipline, his refusal to confuse wealth with faith. He understood something most people never do: that money, in all its forms, is a promise written on air, and air, when pressed too hard, disappears. If you watch this far, remember this: wealth is never about how much you own, but how much of what you own will still matter when the paper burns. Subscribe for more stories that reveal what history's quietest men knew and what the loudest forgot. When the next crisis came, and it always does, people in Millhaven told his story again, not as nostalgia, but as warning. The man who had seen money die twice had left behind something rarer than gold: perspective. Because when trust fades, when markets tremble, and when governments print faster than truth can catch up, the survivors are never the richest. They are simply the ones who remember what value really means. Anton Weiss remembered, and that made all the difference.